Margaret had always been cold to me, but what she announced at our engagement party revealed a family secret that made my fiancé question everything about his life. The backyard was decorated with string lights and white roses, exactly how I'd always dreamed my engagement party would look. My mom had spent weeks planning every detail, from the catered appetizers to the champagne fountain that sparkled under the evening sky. Family and friends mingled on the patio, their laughter mixing with the soft jazz playing from the speakers we'd borrowed from my cousin. I should have been floating on cloud nine, but Margaret's presence cast a shadow over everything. She'd arrived 30 minutes late, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral instead of celebrating her son's engagement. While everyone else complimented my ring and gushed about wedding plans, she sat at a corner table picking at her salad and checking her phone. My fiancé kept trying to include her in conversations, but she'd give one-word answers before retreating back into herself. When my aunt asked about wedding venues, Margaret just shrugged. When my best friend showed her pictures of potential dresses, she barely glanced up. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could see my fiancé's shoulders getting tighter with each dismissive response from his mother. 3 hours into the party, just as my dad was about to make a toast, Margaret suddenly pushed back her chair. The metal legs scraped against the concrete patio, creating a harsh sound that made everyone turn to look at her. She stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. The jazz music seemed too loud suddenly. My dad lowered his champagne glass, confusion written across his face. Margaret's husband reached for her arm, but she pulled away from him. Her eyes were wild, darting around the crowd of 40-something guests who had all gone quiet. Then she opened her mouth and destroyed everything. She declared that her son wasn't actually her biological child. The words came tumbling out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for decades. She said she had kidnapped him as a baby because she was desperate for a family. Her voice cracked as she continued, saying she was tired of living with the guilt and was ready to face the consequences. The champagne glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the concrete. My fiancé's face went completely white, then red, then white again. Margaret kept talking, describing in horrifying detail how she had taken him from a hospital nursery 30 years ago. She talked about waiting for the right moment, about how easy it had been to walk out with a sleeping baby while the nurses were distracted. The party erupted into chaos. My cousin started filming with her phone until my mom grabbed it away from her. My uncle was already dialing what I assumed was 911. 3 of my college friends huddled together near the food table, whispering frantically. My fiancé just stood there, frozen, like someone had hit pause on his entire existence. Margaret's voice got stronger as she continued her confession. She described changing his name, moving across the country, creating a whole new identity for both of them. She talked about the sleepless nights wondering if someone was looking for him, about jumping every time there was a knock at the door. She said she'd watched the news obsessively for years, waiting for a story about a missing baby that would unravel her entire life. My fiancé finally found his voice and started asking questions, but they came out broken and desperate. He wanted to know about his real parents, his real name, if he had siblings somewhere. Margaret just kept shaking her head, tears streaming down her face, saying she was sorry over and over again. The neighbors started coming outside to see what all the commotion was about. Mrs. Chin from next door peeked over the fence, and I could see the teenage boy from 2 houses down recording everything from his bedroom window. This private family moment was becoming a neighborhood spectacle, and I felt sick to my stomach. My mom tried to get everyone to go inside, but nobody wanted to move. We were all transfixed by this woman's breakdown and the implications of what she was saying. My fiancé's entire identity was crumbling in real time, and we were all witnesses to it. That's when something completely unexpected happened. Margaret's husband, who had been sitting silently through this entire confession, suddenly started clapping. Not angry clapping or sarcastic clapping, but genuine, slow applause like he'd just watched an incredible performance. Everyone turned to stare at him like he'd lost his mind. Here his wife was confessing to kidnapping their son, police were probably on their way, and he was applauding? My fiancé looked like he might throw up or pass out or both. But then Margaret's husband stood up and put his arms around his wife. He looked out at all of us gathered on the patio and started explaining what was really happening. His voice was calm and patient, like he was talking to a room full of confused children. He revealed that Margaret had been seeing someone for anxiety about not being good enough as a mother-in-law. She'd been spiraling for months about losing her son to marriage, convinced that I would somehow steal him away from her. The fears had gotten so intense that she'd started creating elaborate fictional scenarios about their relationship. The kidnapping story was her anxiety manifesting as this twisted fantasy where she wasn't his real mother, so it would hurt less when he inevitably chose me over her. In her mind, if she wasn't his biological mother, then losing him wouldn't be as devastating. It was her brain's way of protecting her from the pain she was convinced was coming. My fiancé sank into a chair, his head in his hands. All of us stood there processing this information, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The relief was palpable, but so was the confusion and lingering shock. Margaret was still crying, but now it was from embarrassment rather than guilt. She just confessed to a major crime in front of 40 people, recorded by multiple phones, with the neighbors watching over the fence. Even though it wasn't real, the humiliation was crushing her. My mom started ushering people toward the house, suggesting we give the family some privacy to sort things out. Most of the guests were eager to escape the awkwardness, grabbing their purses and making polite excuses about early mornings. Within 20 minutes, the patio was empty except for immediate family. Update 1. The days following the engagement party were some of the strangest of my life. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from friends and family members who had been there, all wanting to know what was really going on. Some people seemed disappointed that there wasn't actually a kidnapping scandal to gossip about. My fiancé was struggling to process everything that had happened. Even though the confession wasn't real, hearing his mother describe taking him from a hospital had shaken something loose in him. He started questioning everything about his childhood, looking for signs that something had been off. He spent hours going through old photo albums and birth certificates, even though the rational part of his brain knew Margaret had given birth to him naturally. Margaret herself had disappeared into her bedroom and hadn't come out for 3 days. Her husband brought her meals on trays and handled all the phone calls from concerned relatives who had heard about the party through the family grapevine. The story was spreading and morphing as it passed from person to person, with some versions having Margaret actually arrested and others having my fiancé discovering he was adopted. I felt caught in the middle of this family crisis, unsure of my role or how to help. Part of me was angry at Margaret for ruining our engagement party and traumatizing her son with her fictional confession. But another part of me felt sorry for her, knowing that her anxiety about our marriage had driven her to such an extreme mental state. The wedding planning came to a complete halt. We had appointments scheduled with caterers and photographers, but my fiancé couldn't focus on centerpieces and menu tastings when he was still processing what his mother had put him through. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the party and what it meant for our family dynamics going forward. Then, exactly 1 week after the disastrous engagement party, Margaret finally emerged from her bedroom. She had bags under her eyes and had lost weight, but she seemed more like herself than she had in months. She asked if we could all sit down together and talk. What she told us that afternoon completely changed my understanding of the situation. The anxiety about losing her son to marriage was real, but it went much deeper than anyone had realized. Margaret had grown up in a family where marriage meant cutting ties with your parents. Her own mother had barely spoken to her after the wedding, treating her new husband as competition for her daughter's loyalty. Margaret had been terrified that I would do the same thing, that marriage would mean she'd lose her son forever. The fear had consumed her for months, making her cold and distant as a defense mechanism. If she pushed me away first, it would hurt less when I inevitably pushed her out of her son's life. The kidnapping fantasy had started small, just random thoughts about how losing him wouldn't hurt as much if he wasn't really hers. But the thoughts had grown and developed over time, becoming more detailed and elaborate until they felt almost real to her. The night of the engagement party, seeing all of us celebrating and planning a future that didn't seem to include her, had pushed her over the edge. She apologized to both of us, but especially to her son for putting him through such trauma. She explained that she'd never intended to make the confession public, but once she started talking, she couldn't stop. The words had been building up inside her for so long that they'd exploded out like a dam bursting. My fiancé was quiet for a long time after she finished explaining. I could see him processing not just what she'd said, but everything that had led up to this point. Finally, he looked at his mother and asked why she'd never just talked to him about her fears. Margaret's answer broke my heart. She said she'd been afraid that even admitting her insecurities would drive him away. She thought she had to be perfect and supportive and never show any weakness, or she'd lose him. The irony was that trying so hard to avoid losing him had nearly destroyed their relationship anyway. But here's where the story took another unexpected turn. As we were all sitting there processing Margaret's explanation, my fiancé's phone started ringing. The caller ID showed a number from across the country, and when he answered, a woman's voice asked if she was speaking to someone with his specific full name and birth date. The woman introduced herself as a private investigator who had been hired by a family to locate their missing son. She'd been working the case for years, following leads that had all turned into dead ends. But recently, she'd gotten access to some old hospital records that had led her to our city. My fiancé went completely pale as the investigator described the case. A baby had been taken from a hospital nursery 30 years ago, and the family had never stopped looking for him. The description she gave matched my fiancé exactly, down to a distinctive birthmark on his shoulder. We all sat there in stunned silence as the pieces fell into place. Margaret's fictional confession had somehow aligned perfectly with a real case. The investigator wanted to arrange DNA testing to confirm whether my fiancé was the missing child. Margaret started hyperventilating. Her worst nightmare, the scenario she'd created in her mind to cope with her anxiety, was potentially real. The universe had played the cruelest possible joke on her, making her deepest fears manifest in reality. Update 2. The DNA results took 2 weeks to come back, and those were the longest 14 days of our lives. Margaret barely ate or slept, convinced that she was about to lose her son to his biological family. My fiancé swung between hoping the test would be negative and wondering what it would mean if he really had been kidnapped as a baby. I felt like I was watching my future husband and mother-in-law fall apart in slow motion. The wedding had been postponed indefinitely while we waited for answers that would either restore our normal life or completely destroy it. Friends kept asking for updates, but what could I tell them? That we were waiting to find out if my future mother-in-law was actually a kidnapper? The private investigator had connected us with the biological family, who were desperate for any news about their missing son. They sent photos of themselves and other family members, and the resemblance to my fiancé was undeniable. Same nose, same jawline, same way of tilting their head when they were thinking. It was like looking at alternate versions of the man I loved. Margaret spent those 2 weeks going through every photo album and home video she had, trying to remember details from 30 years ago. She'd been so young when her son was born, and the early months were a blur of sleepless nights and postpartum exhaustion. But slowly, she started remembering things that didn't quite fit with her original story. She remembered the pregnancy, the labor, the first time she held him in the hospital. She remembered choosing his name and filling out the birth certificate. She remembered her mother visiting and commenting on how much the baby looked like her side of the family. These weren't the memories of someone who had stolen a child from strangers. When the DNA results finally came back, we all gathered in Margaret's living room to hear them together. The investigator called with the results, and her voice was gentle as she delivered the news. My fiancé was not the missing child. The biological markers didn't match, and while the physical resemblance was striking, it was just one of those weird coincidences that sometimes happen. The relief in the room was overwhelming. Margaret started crying again, but this time from pure joy. Her son really was her son, and the nightmare scenario she'd been living with for 2 weeks was over. My fiancé hugged his mother tighter than I'd ever seen him hug anyone, and I realized that this whole experience had actually brought them closer together. But the story wasn't over yet. The real missing child was still out there somewhere, and his family was still searching for him. The private investigator thanked us for our cooperation and asked if we knew anyone else who might fit the description. It was a long shot, but she'd learned never to give up on any possibility. That's when my fiancé remembered something that seemed insignificant at the time. At his engagement party, before Margaret's dramatic confession, he'd been talking to one of my cousins about childhood memories. The cousin had mentioned being adopted as a baby and never knowing his biological parents. He was the right age, from the right area, and when we really looked at him, the resemblance to the missing child's family photos was even stronger than my fiancé's had been. We called the investigator back and gave her my cousin's information. Within a week, the DNA test confirmed what we'd suspected. My cousin was the missing child, and through the most bizarre series of events, Margaret's fake confession at our engagement party had helped solve a 30-year-old kidnapping case. The reunion between my cousin and his biological family was emotional and beautiful. They'd never stopped believing they'd find him, and discovering that he'd been living a happy life with loving adoptive parents was the best possible outcome. The people who had taken him were long dead, but the family finally had closure and their son back. Margaret became something of a local celebrity for her accidental role in solving the case. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that her fictional kidnapping confession had led to solving a real kidnapping. She started getting calls from other families with missing children, hoping she might have some insight that could help their cases. Update 3. The months following the DNA revelation were transformative for our entire family. Margaret threw herself into helping other families with missing children using her experience and the connections she'd made through her case. She started volunteering with organizations that specialized in long-term missing person cases, and her anxiety about losing her son was replaced with a sense of purpose. My fiancé and I finally got back to wedding planning, but the experience had changed us both. We'd seen how quickly life could turn upside down and how important family connections really were. We decided to have a smaller, more intimate ceremony focused on celebrating the relationships that mattered most to us. Margaret asked if she could help plan the wedding, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely excited about our marriage. She'd realized that gaining a daughter-in-law didn't mean losing a son, but rather expanding the family she'd worked so hard to build and protect. The wedding was beautiful and drama-free, exactly the opposite of our engagement party. Margaret gave a speech about family and love and the unexpected ways that life brings people together. She talked about how fear had almost cost her the relationship with her son and how facing that fear had ultimately made their bond stronger. My cousin attended the wedding with his newly reunited biological family, and seeing them all together was a reminder of how strange and wonderful life could be. A fictional confession at an engagement party had led to a real family reunion, and our traumatic experience had become someone else's miracle. But the biggest surprise came during the reception. As we were cutting the cake and everyone was taking pictures, Margaret pulled me aside for a private conversation. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell me something important, something that would explain why she'd been so afraid of losing her son to marriage. She told me that she'd actually been pregnant with twins 30 years ago, but had lost one of the babies during delivery. The surviving twin was my fiancé, but she'd never told him about his brother. The grief and fear of losing another child had shaped every aspect of how she'd raised him, making her overprotective and possessive in ways that had nothing to do with me personally. Learning this helped me understand Margaret's behavior from a completely different perspective. Her coldness toward me hadn't been about not liking me, but about being terrified of any change that might threaten her remaining child. The kidnapping fantasy had been her mind's way of processing the fear that she might lose him too, just like she'd lost his twin brother. She apologized for not telling me sooner and for letting her fears make our relationship so difficult. She asked if we could start over, building a relationship based on honesty rather than the walls she'd built to protect herself from potential loss. That conversation marked the real beginning of my relationship with Margaret. Over the following months, she shared stories about my fiancé's childhood that helped me understand him better. She taught me family recipes and showed me photo albums full of memories I'd never heard about. Slowly, she became less like a difficult mother-in-law and more like the mother figure I'd never realized I was missing. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most traumatic events can lead to the biggest breakthroughs. Margaret's fictional confession had nearly destroyed our family, but working through the aftermath had actually made us stronger. We'd learned to communicate honestly about our fears and insecurities instead of letting them fester in silence. My fiancé, now husband, often says that our engagement party was the worst and best thing that ever happened to our family. It was traumatic and embarrassing and caused weeks of anxiety and confusion. But it also brought hidden truths to light, solved a decades-old missing person case, and ultimately brought our family closer together. Margaret still volunteers with missing children organizations, and she's helped reunite several other families over the past year. She says that her experience with anxiety and fictional scenarios has given her unique insight into how the mind processes trauma and loss. What started as her personal breakdown has become a way to help others heal from similar experiences. Looking back on that night, I can see how every terrible moment led to something positive. Margaret's dramatic confession revealed her deep-seated fears about losing her son. The DNA testing process brought her and my husband closer together. The discovery of my cousin's true identity gave another family the reunion they'd been hoping for. Even the neighborhood spectacle led to Margaret meeting other people who were dealing with family crises. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret had just talked to us about her fears from the beginning. Would we have been able to work through her anxiety without all the drama and trauma? Probably. But then my cousin might never have been reunited with his biological family, and Margaret might never have found her calling in helping other families. The engagement party that was supposed to celebrate our future together ended up reshaping our entire understanding of family, love, and the unexpected ways that life brings people together. Margaret's fictional confession became a real catalyst for healing, not just in our family but in others as well. Our marriage is stronger because we learned early on how to handle crisis together. Margaret and I have a relationship built on understanding and mutual respect rather than fear and defensiveness. And somewhere out there, families that were torn apart by tragedy have been reunited because of a chain of events that started with an anxious woman's breakdown at a backyard engagement party. The whole experience taught me that truth really is stranger than fiction and that sometimes the most painful moments lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Margaret's worst fears didn't come true, but facing them head-on gave all of us the courage to build something better than what we'd had before.